Well, good morning, Hope City family. Like Sammy said, my name is Gabe, and I am the family life pastor here on staff, and I'm super excited to be with you guys at the adult gathering this morning. I want to start off this morning in a bit of a different way. So before you sigh or look at me crazy, trust me, I want everybody to take a second to think about one of the worst days of your life. Everybody suck the energy out of the room. I knew it was going to happen, but trust me for a second. I know there's a lot of you guys thinking, I didn't come to church to talk about the worst day of my life right now, Gabe. Just trust me for a second, okay? For me, one of the worst days of my life came a couple years ago. It was a few weeks after my wife, Madison, and I'd gotten married, and we were living in this house in Joplin, Missouri, and, I just started having conversations with Adam about what it would be like to come down here and join the Hope City, Arkansas team. And I was super excited for that. So if you had asked me, then life was going really, really well. And then, out of nowhere, the right side of my mouth started to hurt. I was like, oh, it's fine. It's just a toothache, it'll go away. Next day happened, it got worse. And I was like, this is starting to bother me. Then Sunday came around and I was like, a Sunday miracle. It's gone. Awesome. So I went to church and we had just gotten out, and Madison and I were grabbing lunch, and we went by Popeyes. And I don't know if you guys remember at the time, Popeyes made this chicken sandwich that everybody lost their mind over. You would wait an hour in line for it. Well, I finally tried it, and I was so excited. I was like, this is great. It's a great day. My tooth doesn't hurt anymore. I went to church. I got Popeyes. This is awesome. Guys, I took a bite out of it. I forgot which side of my mouth to use. So I bit down, and all of a sudden, it was the most excruciating pain I've ever felt in my life. It was like someone was taking needles and stabbing them into my teeth, my gums, my lip, just stabbing me repeatedly. And I screamed out in pain, and Madison shot up, and she took me to urgent care. There's nothing they could do for me there. So then I just had to sit there and bear it until the dentist's office opened the next morning. Now, I'm not going to lie, it was the worst pain I've ever felt in my life. It was awful. My mouth was throbbing. I couldn't eat anything. I couldn't sleep all night. I'm just sitting there like a psychopath in my bed, when's it going to stop? When's it going to stop? The only thing that helped, for a second, was ice cold water. Just for a second, I was like, ah. And then right back to just throbbing pain. So then in the morning, I go into the dentist's office, and I'm so tired that I'm hearing every other word. I'm so out of it. I'm not understanding completely what they're saying, but I do hear the word double root canal. I hate going to the dentist. The dentist is awful. It's one of my enemies. So then the worst thing on top of all of this is that I can't get in until Wednesday morning. This is Monday morning. I have to go a whole nother day like this. So I get home and I take the medicine that they gave me for pain. I throw it up because there's nothing on my stomach. So now I'm just sitting there again, throbbing in pain, wanting to just pull my teeth out with a wrench. Go get a wrench and yank it out myself. I was supposed to go until Wednesday, but Madison woke up 6 a.m. Tuesday morning, looked at me, and was like, did you get any sleep? I said, no. So she drove me to the dentist's office, and they performed my double root canal. Not great, by the way. It's just drilling going on in your teeth, and you don't know what's happening, and then all of a sudden, you're asleep. It's the weirdest thing ever. So then I came out of it, and my tooth finally ended up feeling all right. But guys, for that time, in that moment, it was the most pain I've ever felt. I wasn't in control of it, and I couldn't do anything to fix it, right? But if I were to think about it just a little deeper, that may not be the worst day of my life. No, for me, it makes sense. And for some of us, it makes sense to go to a day that has tangible, understandable pain. Pain that we can look at and be like, oh, you broke your leg, that must hurt. Oh, your toothache, that must hurt, right? But if we were to think about it for a second, we would probably think about the worst day of our life as a day that had less understandable pain, had more emotion behind it, had more devastating loss, right? Maybe the worst day of your life was the day that you lost your job. And you're sitting in the kitchen table, and you're looking at bill after bill after bill, and you're wondering, what am I going to do? How am I going to fix this? Maybe the worst day of your life was when somebody did something to you that devastated you. Maybe your spouse having an affair. Maybe your child doing something that changes the way you see them forever. Maybe it was when someone around you just manipulated you and lied to you and used you. And you're left sitting there thinking, how can I trust anyone? How can I trust anyone? Or maybe for some of us, for most of us, the worst day of our life would be a day that we lost someone that we loved. Someone that made life better. Someone that gave you all that they were. And now you're sitting there thinking, what am I supposed to do without them? And why couldn't I just have a few more minutes with them? You see, the worst day ever. The worst day ever. And for us in this culture today, we find it way easier to focus on what is happening right now, the bad, than to focus on the good. Like in the good times, life's easy. In the bad times, that's the hard stuff that we talk about, that we look to the negative side of this culture. But guys, just because the bad stuff comes, and just because it seems like it never ends, that doesn't mean that God is not in control. See, we serve a God that is the same on the best days of our lives as he is on the worst day of our lives. You see, in 1 Samuel chapter 30, we're going to come across David in this story, and he must understand that we must rely on God in the midst of adversity in order to continue forward. I'll say it again, we must rely on God in the midst of adversity in order to continue forward. See, these hard days, they will come. They are guaranteed in life, but how do we respond when they get here? If you've got your Bibles, if you could open up to 1 Samuel chapter 30, that's where we're going to be kind of camped out in this morning. And if you were with us last week, then you got to see and hear kind of an understanding of how David and other people became undignified for God. Now, we don't mean undignified in the negative sense or in a disrespectful sense. No, we mean it in a way of David threw off everything that hindered him and went to God. He worshiped him. He had fun with him. He loved him. He didn't care what others thought or others saw. See, that was David on the best days of his life. But how does the man after God's own heart respond when the worst day of his life comes? Some context for where we're going to be at. See, David, for the past year or so, has been hiding out in the land of the Philistines. Yes, Goliath, the Philistines, the enemy of Israel. He's been hiding out there trying to escape, survive, prolong the wrath of Saul. And now he has finally been kicked out of that land. And he is moving with his men to go pick up the families that they left in Ziklag. But when they get there, something surprising happens. If you're following along, we're going to be starting in verse 1. Now when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day, the Amalekites had made a raid against Negeb and against Ziklag. They had overcame Ziklag and burned it with fire, and they had taken captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great. They killed no one, but carried them off and went on their way. So David and his men come upon this city after it has been ransacked and burned down, and they don't find their families anywhere. And they figure out they've been taken as slaves by their enemies. Families ripped apart, and God's people here are split. Let's continue in verse 3. And when David and his men came to the city, they found it burned with fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him raised their voices and wept until they had no more strength to weep. David's two wives had also been captive, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. You see, these men were warriors who had gone out into battles before. They were the manliest of men in the entire world. And what do when they find their families have been taken? They weep. They lose control. They try to make sense of it. They couldn't bring back their families. And in this moment, they sob and they cry. And where's David in the middle of all this? He's with his men, mourning the loss of his own family. Have you ever cried so hard that you couldn't get up? That you didn't have the strength to sit up and stand? See, these were violent, angry, passionate cries from men that thought that they had lost everything and everyone that they had ever loved. And when the sadness began to wear off, something else set in, the anger. The anger set in. And who do you think these men blamed? Well, they can't see the Amalekites. They're long gone. They can't see the people that aren't there. They can't blame them. So they look at David and say, David, how could you do this to us? You are our king. You were supposed to protect us. You were supposed to protect our families. You were supposed to lead us. We're going to continue in verse 3. And David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because all the people were bitter in soul, each for his own sons and daughters. The pressure is building around David. The walls begin to get taller, and the weight of an entire group of people falls on his shoulders. Have you ever felt that kind of weight before? I know for some of the parents in you, you're shaking your head yes, and I get it, moms and dads, like getting your kids here dressed and ready to go on Sunday morning seems and can be a miracle in and of itself, right? Like, it's a little hard, I get it. But I highly doubt that on the worst days, even when they're at their worst, they speak of stoning you to death. Maybe some of them do, but that's like besides the point. But seriously, like, David here is on his own. He's on his own, and these threats against his life are coming from a real place. They're coming from broken people trying their best to come up with an answer to solve their problems, coming up with an answer to make themselves feel better. Someone's got to pay. My family's not here anymore, and I'm going to make someone pay. So what does David do? What can he do? The worst day of his life. His family is gone, taken captive. He feels the most distance he ever has from God. His people are broken and wanting nothing to do with him. And on top of all of that, his life is now threatened by his own men. David turns to God. If you're following along, let's finish the rest of verse 6. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. The first place to start when you find yourself dealing with a hard time, a bad day, some adversity, is to look for God. You see, in 1 Samuel chapter 30, David lays out 4 biblical ways in which we can respond to adversity, in which we can handle our own worst days. We mourn, seek, move, and share. First, we mourn. Now, if you take a second to look back at chapter 30, after David and his men find out exactly what has gone and happened to their family in the town, what do? Well, let's read, starting in verse 3. And when David and his men came to the city, they found it burned with fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. Then David and his people who were with him raised their voices and wept until they had no more strength to weep. They all come to a place of brokenness together. A deep sadness. They begin to mourn the loss of their loved ones. You see, loved ones they may never see again. They don't know what's about to happen. They don't know if they'll ever come back. They just know that in this moment, they're gone, taken away by their enemies. And so they mourn. They begin to weep, cry out, sob, lose control of themselves, right? Because the anguish they feel for the ones that they loved, their loved ones. You see, today we may think that we are only allowed to mourn or grieve when we lose someone, when we lose a loved one, a friend, a family member. And yes, we are called to mourn and to be sad and to weep. But that is not the only time that we may mourn. No, there are other times in our life it isn't true. See, we may mourn adversity when it comes into our lives in different ways. Like, we may mourn the loss of our own youth or a child's youth when we grow up or we see our children grow up. We may mourn the loss of stability or a part of our own identity when we lose our job. We may mourn the fact that our lives won't be the same or our dreams will not come true when something changes how we live drastically. And we may mourn the loss of a loved one as well. You see, there was this woman, and she had a brain-damaged daughter. Sometimes the sadness she felt over her daughter was so much to bear that she couldn't do it alone. She posted a letter on social media recently talking about this, and in it she writes, "I can hardly bear it sometimes. My most recent wave of grief came just last year before her 16th birthday. As the day approached, I found myself brooding over all the things that she would never be able to do. What did I do? What I've learned to do again and again, I did what I believe is the only thing to do to conquer grief, and that is to embrace it. I cried and cried and cried and faced the truth of my grief head on. Today in our culture, it may seem weak and be seen as something not to do, to show emotion, to show sadness, to show grief, to mourn. But was David weak? Was Job weak? Were Mary and Martha weak? Was Abraham weak? Was Jesus weak? You see, throughout Scripture, we see time after time in which men and women who gave their all to God had moments in which they had to reflect and mourn the loss of something around them. Adversity hit, and they did not let their sadness stand in the way. Though they didn't hide it, they didn't push it down. No, they embraced it. Ecclesiastes 3:4 says this: there is a time to cry and a time to laugh. There is a time to mourn and a time to dance. There's this author named Jason Wilson, and he wrote a book, Cry Like a Man, which, when you hear that title, it seems a little weird. Like, cry like a man. Men aren't supposed to cry. They're supposed to be strong. But when he was releasing the book, he did an interview, and in that interview he said this: my passion is to help boys and men find strength to become courageously transparent about their own brokenness as God sheds light on the symptoms. That's what mourning is, guys. To be transparent about the brokenness within us and to allow God to shed light on it. On our worst days, we are not weak. No, we are strong. First, we mourn what was. Second, we seek. Now, I don't know about a lot of you guys, but during the pandemic, there was a bunch of stuff that came and went, and a lot of trends and things that happened, and there's a lot that actually stayed. Like, Zoom calls are like a thing, virtual meetings, DoorDash and grocery deliveries, right? Oh, for every one of those, though, there is something that we kind of left behind, thankfully, right? Like, for every one of those, we have a Tiger King. We have making homemade banana bread. We have at-home parent teaching. I know a lot of people are kind of done with that. And of course, Peloton, right? Like all that stuff. And another thing that I'm personally super thankful for is at-home haircuts being gone. Some of you guys are laughing. You may know where this story is going. Some of you guys may. But some of us had some okay experiences. I did not. I had a friend named Derek. Derek's a great guy. He's still one of my best friends to this day. And he was like, I was living in Joplin at the time, and he said, Gabe, I can get you a haircut. I was like, cool, Derek, sweet. So I'm sitting in the back on the porch, and he cuts up my size. He does a really good job. He does a fine job. I'm like, awesome, yes. My friend Andrew says, I want a haircut too. So while he's got the trimmers on, Derek cuts his hair, and I get impatient. And I'm like, how hard can it be? Like, realistically. How hard can it be just to trim across the forehead? Just to get out of my eyes? So I do it. And guys, it's a lot harder when you forget to brush it down evenly. Yeah, that's right. I had like a V on my head from like this top of my forehead to the bottom of my eye. I looked like the coolest guy ever. Like just the awesomest guy ever. Madison came over later that night and she was like, oh. And I said, you know what? Buzz it. Buzz it all. Buzz it all. We're done. And I think we have a picture of that on the screen. This is the final result. And that's the shortest my hair ever was, and it was not fun. You see, when I sought out help, when I went and sought for someone else's help, I ended up working, right? But when I got restless and tried to do it on my own, that's when it kind of fell apart. Well, David, we find him, remember, we're in the worst day of his life, so what does he do? Well, David seeks after God. If you've got your Bibles, we're going to continue in verse 7 of chapter 30. And David said to Abiathar, the priest, the son of Ahimelech, bring me the ephod. So Abiathar brought the ephod to David, and David inquired of the Lord, shall I pursue this band? Shall I overtake them? And he answered them, pursue, for you shall overtake them, and shall surely rescue. Now when David is caught in a hard place, in a hard time, he doesn't know what to do next. What does he do? He seeks after God. You see, the ephod was a spiritual apron that the high priest of Israel would wear, right? And Samuel would say on times from his writings that King Saul and King David would specifically seek out the ephod and use it to directly ask God a question, to seek his will directly, right? How many of us, if we were to really look at ourselves, do we genuinely take the time to ask God a question? How often do we genuinely go out and focus on seeing what God's will for us is? Or are we too scared that we may not like the answer we receive? That we may not agree with what God is saying to us? You see, whether he answers yes or no, whether he supports you or says don't do that, God is in the middle of it with you. He does not put you through anything that you cannot endure without him. He gives you the strength to endure, to persevere. And guess what? Whether it's in this life or the next life, God will fulfill his promises to you. Even when he says, no, God is working in ways that are beyond our own control. You see, when adversity comes, that's when we answer and make the conscious decision to push through to the will of God. We must not let our own pride and self-doubt get in the way of that. That's a big issue for me. I have this idea that I can do it myself, but then God's just shaking his head, laughing, saying, Gabe, what are you doing? What are you doing? So often when hard times comes, we can forget about the good God that we serve. Our current trials seem so big in the moment of our life. But God is still there. 1 John 5:14 says this, and this is the confidence that we have toward him, that if we ask anything according to his will, he will hear us. And just like he did with David, he wants to lead you to his will today. On our worst days, we are not lost. No, we are seekers. Second, we seek out God. Third, we move. Now, watch what happens when David gets his answer, gets the will from God, and watch what he does. See, starting in verse 9. So David set out, and 600 men who were with him, and they stayed, and they came to the brook Besor, where those who were left behind stayed. But David pursued him and 400 men. 200 stayed behind, who were too exhausted to cross the brook of Besor. David didn't stay still. He didn't wallow in his sorrows. He didn't say, you know what, I'm not going to go. No, he moved. He went. He was ready to march into battles. And although many of us will never experience what it's like to march into a real battle, that doesn't mean the same concept doesn't ring true today. We are meant to move. You see, that doesn't mean we do it that day. No, the mourning process, the things that we need to process through take time and effort. But when we get our answer from God, God expects us to move. We push through. We don't sit back. We don't let the guilt and weight of the world weigh us down. That only hurts us. And see, David did just that. And in verse 17, we read this, and David struck them down from twilight until the evening of the next day. And not a man of them escaped, except for 400 young men who mounted camels and fled. David recovered all that the Amalekites had taken, and David rescued his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, whether small or great, sons or daughters, spoils, or anything that had been taken. David brought back everything. And just as God had promised David, he delivered him now. Now, this story isn't over yet, but I want you guys to take a second to think about it from a different perspective. Think about it from the men of David. They had just lost their families. They were losing faith in David, and they didn't know whether or not that they could trust him. Right? But then David comes to them and tells them what God says, and they don't know what to do. You see, they had the freedom to make the conscious choice to follow after God's will, to follow after what their king and rightful heir to the throne said to them. But they could have not. They could have stayed behind. They could have disobeyed their Lord. They could have said, you know what, I'm kind of tired of David. I'm out. I don't want anything to do with him. But no, they decided to push through. To push through because they had the freedom to choose. See, I think we are kind of caught in the same kind of trap today. We're kind of juggling between 2 parts of our lives of what we think we know is right and what we truly know is right. Like what we think and what we're trying to justify and what we're trying to make right is not what God says is true and right, correct? Like we have these things of how often do we think we know who to blame for when life goes wrong? Like we know who to point at and say that's their fault. Or how often in our lives do we make bad things seem right and good in our own heads? How often do we forget who to seek? And how often do we forget we're called to move? See, we do have that freedom. The freedom to push through adversity in order to fulfill God's will for our own lives. Romans 8:28 says this, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. On our worst days, we are not stuck. No, we are free. Third, we move towards God's will. Finally, we share. Now, 2 weeks ago, I got to take an awesome group of elementary schools to our third through fifth grade camp, and it was so much fun. I love camp, and camp was awesome, and we had a ton of fun, and it was a blast. But on the last day, during the morning session, I got to be the kind of camp DJ, right? I'm just trying to play songs that'll get people singing, having fun. And I come across a song that I hadn't seen in so long. And for those of you that are my age, you'll appreciate it. For anybody older, you may have missed it. For anybody younger, you definitely don't know what I'm talking about. But I came across a song called We're All in This Together from High School Musical. Now, for those in my generation, that is an awesome throwback, right? Disney Channel movie, it was the best. Guys, I played it at camp, and no one knew a single word. They looked at me and they're like, what is that? I'm like, you're in third grade. You're a child. I'm so old now. But guys, it got me thinking about this. We are all in this together. One way or another, we have been called to be in community. That we don't face these things alone. No, we don't carry the burden by ourselves. No, we are called to share. We aren't meant to go about life as if we are abandoned by ourselves on this deserted island, right? We are surrounded by those that love us. That's how God designed us. See, David, even in this story, he had his men with him the entire time. And even when those left him, even when we came across those that had left him and abandoned him, he still decided to share. Look at what verse 21 says. Then David came to the 200 men who were too exhausted to follow him, and who had been left at the brook Besor. And they went out to meet David and to meet the people who were with him. And when David came near the people, he greeted them. Then all the wicked and worthless fellows among him who had gone with David said, because they did not go with us, we will not give them any spoil that we have recovered, except that each man may lead away his wife and child and depart. But David said, you shall not do so, my brothers, in what the Lord has given us. He has preserved us and given into our hand the band that came against us. Who would listen to you in this matter? For as his share is who goes into battle, so shall his share be who stays by the baggage. They shall share alike. How many of us, if we're being honest, would answer like one of David's wicked men, right? Like the idea that they weren't with us, so they don't get what we have now. It's like we're back in school and we're all working on this group assignment, and because I didn't see what you worked on, that means you didn't work on anything, right? But David understood that we are all in this together. David understood that we all have a part to play. And David understood that without God, none of this matters or none of this would happen. So why are we getting so defensive? When you see yourself in the middle of adversity, take a second and look around at those around you, those beside you. Some are more obvious than others, because sometimes we see people that we don't think are supporting us, but they are in a way that only God could put into place. That only God can make happen, right? And see, the sharing doesn't end with just things. No, the sharing is found in the burdens we bear, the pain we feel, the hurt we carry. God designed us in such a way that we are not supposed to hold on to it by ourselves. No, we are able to look around and lean on those who have come beside us, that love us in this time. And the action of sharing is not one that is limited to just people in the middle of adversity. No, even on our best days, we are called to look at our friends, at our loved ones, at our community, and say, where is the hurt and how can I help? We are called to share in each other's battles, because there was one that already shared in ours. 1 Peter 6:7 is a great reminder of what is to come when we share in this together. In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes though is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. On our worst days, we are not alone. No, we are together. Finally, we share with others. As we come to a close at the end of today, I want you guys to think about this one question. I want you guys to think about this one question. When adversity hits, where do you turn? Where do you turn? Do you turn to what's around you, to what the world says is what you're supposed to be going through, how you're supposed to feel, or do you give it up to God? See, so often we can make this mistake. We can make this mistake of taking everything upon ourselves, of putting the entire weight of the world on our own shoulders, of carrying every burden by ourselves, of making sure our own hurts and pains are the only thing that we feel. And instead of sharing it or giving it or talking about it, we push it deeper and deeper and deeper and ignore it and say, you know what? No, I'm not going to give it to anybody because there's no one that knows how I'm feeling right now. No one can ever sense how this hurt is affecting me right now. And no one can carry this burden because look at how they would say about me. Look at what they would do to me. Look at how they would treat me. But there was one person who took upon himself every one of those feelings, every burden, every pain, every hurt, every adversity, every worst day upon himself. See, this guy, he went to a cross and he died, but he didn't deserve to. And he didn't have to, no, he chose to, so that he could look you and me in the face and say, I know what you're feeling. I know what you've been through. I know you're hurt. I know your pain. But trust me, it doesn't end here. This guy was Jesus. And Jesus died on a cross so that we would never have to experience life without him ever again. So that we could know in our deepest, truest hearts that we are not alone. He died on a cross so that when my time on earth comes up, so that when your time on earth is up, we can spend eternity with him forever. Jesus ultimately gives us the strength to continue on through adversity, even when we may not think we can, because he is right there with us. We must rely on God in the midst of adversity in order to continue forward, so that when the worst day of our life comes, we may mourn, seek, move, and share. Guys, we're going to be moving into a time of prayer. And what that looks like for us each week is just a moment to sit there and reflect. Maybe you want to talk to God. Maybe you want to sit there quietly. But while you're sitting there today, I want you to think about this. What do I need to do the next time adversity hits God? Maybe you ask God, where have you been in the middle of it? But whatever you ask him, I want you today to genuinely sit there in silence and listen for an answer. Because just like we saw today, when we seek after God and what he has to say, he's always there and he always listens. He hears us. But most importantly, he wants to give you an answer. I'm going to pray, and then we're going to have our communion team come in and set it up. Just take a few moments to sit there and listen and hear from God. Dear God, thank you for today. Thank you that we have your love and that we have you in our lives as a marker of where we have been, but also a marker of where we're going, God. God, I'm so thankful that you are the same God today on my best day as you are on my worst days, and every day in between. That you show up and you love and support me, and that you're never too far away from me. But God, ultimately, I thank you so much for what your son did on the cross, for my sake, and for the sake of everyone around me. God, I'm thankful for you and all you've done for me. In your name I pray.